So welcome back. Now we're going to hear from the Congressional Blockchain Caucus, Fireside, moderated by Kristen Smith, the Director of External Affairs for the Blockchain Association. Kristen, thanks for joining us today.
Thank you, Bill. Glad you could all be here this morning. We're going to spend a little bit of time talking about the work that Congress is doing, specifically the Congressional Blockchain Caucus and their work, as well as some of the other policy and regulatory issues and potential government use cases for blockchain technology. So real quickly, we don't have a whole lot of time. We'll do brief introductions. I have Tiffany with Representative Schweikert's office, who has been on the Hill now, I guess, for 7 years and handles the work of the Congressional Blockchain Caucus for Mr. Schweikert. We have Bill Rockwood, who is the Financial and Technology Policy Advisor for Representative Darren Soto from Florida. We have Jason Brett, who is the founder of the Value Technology Foundation and is also a board advisor on the Wall Street Blockchain Alliance. And then we also have Alan McQuinn. He's a senior policy analyst for the Information Technology and Innovation Foundation, also known as ITIF. So thank you everyone for being here today. Why don't we jump into it, then we'll open it up for some questions at the end. But maybe, why don't we start with you, Tiffany? So Congress doesn't have a very particularly strong reputation for being good with technology issues. I think we all sort of have that image in our mind of Mark Zuckerberg being asked some ridiculous questions by various senators. And understandably so, these are very busy people who have to keep up with a range of issues, and so they don't always have the luxury of going deep. Can you tell us a little bit about the origin of the Congressional Blockchain Caucus, the type of work that it does, and sort of how it's evolved over time?
Yeah, happy to. So, yeah, the Facebook hearing is usually the joke I make where I'm trying to teach blockchain to those same members. So I will say I'm a little biased. I think the House did a little bit better. So, but yeah, so the Congressional Blockchain Caucus began in the 114th Congress, and it's always been equally bipartisan. It's technology, tech issues are one of those, great areas that still, you can see a bunch of bipartisan work being done. But yeah, the main goal of the caucus is to educate, and educate. We've done tons of briefings, demos. I think you guys had the folks from West Virginia up here earlier. We had votes come in and did a demo where staff got to vote on who their favorite founding father was. It was great. You kind of saw how it clicked for some of the staff after they got to, see, you scanned a little card that was like your identification, so you kind of authenticated yourself. And then you had a big board where you saw like the tokens or essentially the hash come up, and it was like, great, you got a check mark, you got to see that your vote counted, and there was the hash, and this is the token, so that sort of transaction that occurred. And the questions kind of went from very skeptical to, well, how much would this cost to install? How secure is this? And it's like, great, so happy you asked me. As you're gonna hear throughout the day, blockchain has a lot of, wonderful potential, and it's doing ridiculous things already. So my job isn't necessarily to sell blockchain, but to, show folks what it can do and what it's doing today and how it can make our lives easier. So, talking about just with members on the Hill, I don't, maybe besides my boss and a handful of folks, I don't know if they know how like Apple Pay works or how the algorithm on an Uber or a Lyft app, triggers like the closest driver to you. You just know that it makes your life easier. And so that's what we're trying to do with the Blockchain Caucus.
No, I think the education component is a huge key. At the Blockchain Association, we do a lot of lobbying on policy issues, and it's really hard to get into those discussions until we have sort of that foundational layer. So I think it's really important. Bill, maybe you can talk a little bit. Can you shed some light on what sort of is exciting members of Congress about the technology, but also maybe some of the misunderstandings that are out there that the caucus is sort of working to clear up?
Yeah, and again, the education component's huge, where at staff level, I spend most of my time just what is blockchain. At the member level, we're at a stage of trying to get beyond Bitcoin. You know, everyone's seen Bitcoin in the news, the market volatility, you know, what is it being used for? And while those things are important, I think people often conflate Bitcoin and blockchain, and it's very hard to separate the two, especially when you're dealing with members that, you know, didn't grow up with smartphones or aren't very, you know, they have trouble with email. So it's like understanding the plumbing that allows your email to work is an even bigger ask. So getting beyond Bitcoin is the way I say it, you know, beyond, you know, is this being used to fund human trafficking and terrorist financing? And, you know, so a lot of times I have to flip the discussion. And actually the Russian subpoena was originated because 14 people used Bitcoin for their transactions, and that's how the whole Russia probe was launched. So you sort of have to flip the discussion with a lot of members, and you know, that's probably the greatest challenge, where you actually have to figure out each one what they care about, and then figure out, identify a blockchain solution. So you don't start with Bitcoin or blockchain, because people kind of, you know, especially the members, start to glaze over a little bit. But just make the conversation relatable, and here's a problem you're working on, and there's a technology solution that can help.
I want to pivot, I want to get back to some of the policy issues towards the end, but I want to pivot to Alan. So ITIF recently issued a report or a white paper on sort of blockchain, how it works, its use cases, some of the policy issues. I know we touched upon this a little bit in the last panel, but can you provide a quick sort of overview of some of the things, the use cases for governments that were highlighted in your report?
Sure. So if anyone is wanting to read a very long and interesting report, I think it's at itif.org. It's our blockchain guide to policymakers. I'm just going to pitch it. So I think that it's very useful when we're considering a technology to really look at its value add. And when it comes to blockchain technologies, it's the idea of decentralizing authority while maintaining trust. And to that end, I think it's important to understand, because not every use case of blockchain is going to be efficient or effective, because it does create redundant computing tasks. So when we looked at this in our report, we highlighted a few areas where the public sector has adopted the technology or looked at the technology. And fortunately, the previous panel did a lot of legwork for me, but I'll summarize a little bit and add some nuance. So one of these areas is in asset tracking. And a lot of different federal agencies are looking at asset tracking and logistics and supply chain management for use in the blockchain. And this includes like the Department of State or the Department of the Defense, where they have very complex supply chains with a lot of both private and public entities. And often when you have these incredibly complex supply chains, there's misinformation that's accidentally entered or inaccuracies. And creating the single entity, the single network of trust is really beneficial. So that's one area where the blockchain is very useful. And we see it happening right now in the private sector often, especially with the experiments that have been produced by IBM and Walmart is a good example. The second one that I'd highlight was also highlighted by the previous panel, which is registration. So take land management and land registration, right? You have a network where people often have to submit paper files that can be faked, and then it's up to the government agency to decipher whether something is real or not. And we've seen a lot of states and localities make a lot of headway with digitization in this area, but blockchain offers the ability for them to create this much more fundamental auditing process. And we see that start to take hold, both in other countries like in Georgia, as well as in pilots here in the United States from Wyoming, as we heard, as well as Illinois. And I think this is one of the areas that going forward we're going to see a lot of growth in, because it does cut down on some of the fraud and counterfeiting. And the third, we also heard, the third case study I'll highlight is identity. And this is something that was touched upon briefly, and it's one of the harder applications where Switzerland has recently rolled out one for bicycles. And I think as this technology starts to be proven, and it showed that you don't actually have to store sensitive information on a blockchain, like that you shouldn't. You can obviate some of these privacy concerns by storing the information in secure servers and using attestations over a blockchain to prove it without actually having to reveal it. And I think that's something that is often lost in these conversations, and the true value add of this technology when it comes to identity management.
Jason, why don't we turn to you? I know one of the things that I find when interacting with policymakers in Congress or at various agencies is, there is a lot of concern that, I guess starting with Bitcoin, there's potentially some limitations to the way that system works, both from sort of a speed and energy consumption perspective. And that I think there was a hearing last year with Nouriel Roubini who sort of highlighted some of these. And I remember I found that was so frustrating because there's so much innovation and that's happening, both with these permissionless blockchains and also on the permission side. And that just because something is the way it is today doesn't mean that's going to be that way in the future. Can you talk a little bit about what role the government could play in research and development around this space?
Yeah, absolutely. With the Value Technology Foundation, I thought it was really critical that we look at a way that the United States can keep up with other nations in terms of this technology and its development. My personal belief is that the United States has a problem with this new emerging blockchain technology, and it's not cryptocurrency. What it is us potentially losing the blockchain race to other nation states and our foreign countries. And so for me, one of the things I did, and I had the great opportunity of approaching Bill Rockwood and Congressman Soto's office, was talking about ways in which the United States might look at doing some research and development initiatives. On the proactive side, we have a lot of the policy discussion where we get bogged down a little bit in the regulations and how to have the private sector help. This really ties to earlier when we heard from Frank Yanis about how can the public sector play more of a role, and if he could have answered that differently, he would have said the public sector does have played a role. The Congressional Blockchain Caucus is your leadership now that you have on this particular technology at the federal level. And so my idea was simply to look at what could we do to make sure we accelerate and stay ahead of this technology for the United States. And it was using a federally funded research and development center, or FFRDC. This country has a rich history of using this, going all the way back to the Manhattan Project in terms of developing the nuclear weapon, space race, everything. We have great agencies coming up here after this panel, DARPA, NIST, and their jobs are to keep us ahead technologically. So to me, there is, as Alan mentioned, there's good uses for blockchain and maybe there's not good uses for blockchain. There's a lot that we have to learn. But one thing that is very evident from the states that we had speak and then from the international countries that are speaking later on this technology is there is a huge amount of interest because it's essentially a foundational technology, perhaps as important as the internet. And we have other countries like China's president saying it's 10 times as important as the internet and it's a foundational technology. So for me to see that we can maybe invest some money into the research and development of this at the public level, just as we sort of had with the internet and DARPA, where we had the DARPA net that then evolved into the private sector's use of it from the public sector working on it and accelerating that technology. And so the two ideas we had, or research and development initiatives, turned into two really because of Bill, because I was sort of just thinking of one FFRDC, and I'll let him add as far as we ended up thinking of two, which I think really makes sense to support the United States. And I want to say too, the FFRDC idea will allow private sector, academia, all the experts to come together in a way that they can work together, keep all their information private, and support the US government on what they need to know about this technology and help develop it.
If I may add, we've had other foundational technologies such as the cell phone that everyone has today and the internet that really were founded and created because of government grants and government money that helped with private sector development, and this is very important. Right now in our federal budget, the blockchain money that's allocated to a blockchain is a rounding error of a rounding error of a rounding error, and we really need to start thinking about how we can be competitive, as Jason said, in this technology.
And I'll springboard, because those were two of the initiatives we worked on together, and we kind of subdivided, as Jason mentioned, into two initiatives. One would be through defense applications, and the other would be for commercial and business applications. And not to, segment the technology, but just realizing that, things on the defense side tend to get funded a little quicker in this country. So we kind of identified a strategy of utilizing the FFRDC tools to help coordinate national level strategy, where right now we had some of the FDA folks, other federal agencies are doing great work, but we just want to make sure that there's some level of coordination amongst agencies, that we're not duplicating efforts and we can use our resources most efficiently. So our ideas and the initiatives we're working on were just to kind of house those in one place, one for the defense side, one for the non-defense side. And we're getting some traction on one of them. Hopefully, as some of the budget reports come out in the next 2 weeks, we have our fingers crossed, but it's looking good for one of them.
Well, we know Congress is learning about this. We know governments can utilize the technology in many ways and can potentially also accelerate the US. Why don't we pivot a little bit and talk about some of the public policy challenges that are posed by this technology? And maybe Alan and Jason, I'll kind of have you chime in and feel free as well, and then we can wrap up by talking about some of the proposed solutions that are out there. But Alan, do you want to take a crack first?
Sure. So with every emerging technology, there is often these rough spots where there's existing regulation but up against its implementation and development, right? And this is definitely the case with blockchain technology. You can see it especially in the financial sector. But because we're a government audience, I'll skew a little bit away from that and talk about 3 other major policy areas that we got to get right in order to be able to adequately capture the benefits of this technology. The first is, of course, privacy, right? There's a lot of questions around the implementation of this technology, and especially if you start doing silly things like putting personal information on a blockchain that is immutable, or it's very difficult to remove information of. It runs aground with a lot of privacy law. And in Congress, we're having this big debate right now about what our federal privacy law should look like if we do in fact create one. And states are having those same debates all over the United States. We've seen in Europe the implementation of the GDPR, which is their federal privacy data regulation bill, and it definitely has friction with certain implementations of blockchain because it requires something called the right to be forgotten or the right to erasure, where you can request someone delete information, and that often runs into problems with blockchain technologies where that information is unable to be erased. Another area that I'll highlight, because we have a government audience here today, is procurement. We often have a lot of problems and rigidity in our system in purchasing new technologies. So right now, if you're in the federal sector and you're going to go out and want to buy a blockchain-based application, if it's not on one of the blanket service agreements, which are these blanket tech procurement contracts, then you have to purchase it over the open market. And this comes with a lengthy process in order to do that. And by the time you're able to actually buy this technology, oftentimes it's out of date. As we've seen, this entire conversation with blockchain has evolved since the time I started writing that report. Things have increased so rapidly, it's it's amazing. The third policy barrier I'll highlight, and this is more particularized to some of the regulators that I've seen some folks in the room, often lack the ability to become more educated on actually figuring out and regulating this technology. So a good example of this is the CFTC, the Commodities Futures Trading Commission, which is barred from actually participating in some of these innovative fintech projects unless they pay for the whole project in their statute. And that's not a good model for them to be able to actually become more educated and work more closely with these different types of technologies and the businesses that are offering them to better understand them. And so going forward, I think another thing that we really should think about from the agencies to the regulators is how can we become more educated in this space?
Yeah, I would say, you know, one of the things I thought of with the words that we have, that we use, it really goes back to Tiffany's point about education. That's the biggest public policy challenge, because what you will see, to just put it out there, is you'll have somebody from Congress saying we should ban cryptocurrencies. So what we have to think about is the words that are used and how we describe what we're doing. I have a strong belief that there are blockchain and cryptocurrency professionals that are really interested in this space. I'm sure everyone here who is coming to this because you have that interest in blockchain and other emerging technologies. And so to me, blockchain is kind of this buzzword, very similar to what we had when we had the internet. And then from the internet, we then had information technology. We had a field, an industry to describe the activities that we're doing that could capture all the different things that the internet does. To me, my proposition is that we have value technology. This could capture all the words of distributed ledger technology, blockchain, cryptocurrency, everything that might be slightly out there in terms of a word that might shy government folks away from, and be able to explain it simply that, hey, there's some people that work in IT, and I'm not saying this has to be the right word, but maybe it's value technology or a way to describe the emerging technology in a way to show that it's a serious industry to professionals. I think that, to me, the number one public policy challenge is explaining what this whole blockchain thing is and communicating it in a way so people don't go away either misguided or misinformed or misunderstanding what it is or think somehow there's a solution that needs to be applied. The second one I would say is really you've seen this whole burgeoning interest of ICOs, you know, the initial coin offerings, people looking to invest in the space. A lot of that is that excitement that they've had from the blockchain technology because a lot of people made so much money in the internet, they're all seeing this as a new opportunity. And so you have all these private companies investing in new ways of tokenized products for something that doesn't even necessarily exist yet because they believe the ecosystem is going to do really well. That's created a lot of challenges in terms of not just picking on one agency like the SEC, but in general, how do you regulate this new space? I mean, this is a challenge. The important thing at the end of the day is there are these public policy challenges, both in terms of raising money for this new technology, the privacy concerns, as Alan says. But when you look at who we have here today, we've had West Virginia, Maryland, Lafayette, Louisiana, Wyoming. You know, later we're going to have Bahrain, India, Azerbaijan, Estonia, and Austria. And you know, when you look at all these different countries that are investing in this technology, and then you look at all the states that are looking at it, the federal government has a role to play here, and it's very evident. And I think, to me, this Congressional Blockchain Caucus is the pioneers of that role that needs to be played.
Tiffany, there's also been tax policy issues. Your boss is on the House Ways and Means Committee and has been pretty active in this space. Can you talk a little bit about some of those issues that are out there that, you know, either Congress needs to address or maybe the IRS?
So specifically, my boss has a de minimis provision essentially touching on like cryptocurrencies. So anybody that has like Bitcoin or you name it, whatever, there is no real clarity from the IRS on how you need to file any of that paperwork. And so essentially we've done, and you have been on them as well, and different members of the Blockchain Caucus have sent letters over to the SEC as well as the IRS to sort of ask for some of these clarities. But yeah, I mean, we've sent over to the IRS, I think now. This is probably our third letter that we just did to them to sort of ask. But I mean, this is an issue that affects, I would imagine, every member of Congress's constituency. I'm sure there's somebody in every state that has cryptocurrency, and right now there's nothing really to tell you how to correctly file these, and so we have a simple bill just to address, like de minimis. So right now for foreign transactions, I think it's like $600 is the number where you don't need to report. And so our bill would tie that in line. So if you're, if you have cryptocurrency and you have something change, or you buy a thing of coffee, or you name it, you're within that like window. So it can provide. That's something that we believe that is an easy fix to sort of provide some clarity and some, safe harbor for folks, an everyday individual. So, but yeah, I don't know. You were on financial services. I don't know if there was any other stuff that you guys were looking at, but yeah, it's a very. Again, we're trying to educate, and we've done tons of these like 101s to try to educate different members of Congress on, and their staff on why they need to care about this, because right now, it feels like we're just trying to drag folks along because we need clarity on some of these things, especially in the tax space. But I don't know if you had anything you wanted to add.
No, and part of the tension is, asking the executive agency, what's going on, write a letter for clarity. And the line we have to walk in congressional offices is we don't want to, and one of the taglines for the Congressional Blockchain Caucus is that we don't want to inhibit innovation, but we also need to make sure something is happening. There are these various issues that if they don't get resolved, really inhibit innovation. And the tax issue is one of them. We're at a point where companies might want to locate abroad, or investors might start to have their to reside in other jurisdictions because they're worried about an enforcement case or the IRS coming. I think most people want to be good actors, and just that's the biggest sign is like we don't want to pass, sweeping legislation at this point. We're in the early stages, but we're kind of at a delicate balance where how do we get congressional offices to act if they need to, or how do we help encourage clarity in the space?
Well, and I know that it sounds like you guys are having some success because the IRS commissioner has indicated that he's going to be releasing some guidance in terms of how to pay your taxes, how to calculate fair market value, how to calculate basis, because all this is treated as property. And so hopefully we should be getting that soon. And then I know on the de minimis front, the companies that I represent find that to be a really critical thing that we need to achieve, not only to enable a different way to buy your cup of coffee, but a lot of these sort of open source software systems that are being developed, having these small transactions where there is a token that is used in the system to access these services, if there needs to be, if you need to keep track and calculate capital gains every time you interact with that system, that would really prevent those types of things from taking off. So hugely important work that both of your bosses are doing. Bill, do you want to talk a little bit about sort of the role of the SEC versus the CFTC versus maybe the FTC when it comes to looking at these tokens and these permissionless systems or these sort of securities tokens?
Yep, and sort of where we're at in Congress is, we're trying to crawl before we walk, and we take a lot of meetings every day, or maybe not every day, but periodically, and themes start to emerge. One of them is the tax issue. The other is just the clarity of, every time I have a crypto anything or a blockchain anything, I'm very nervous about an SEC enforcement action. And we're hearing from a lot of startups, that up to 50% of their startup costs are going into legal, into paying lawyers so that they can be compliant. And even if that's the case, there's still a situation where the laws may be different. Maybe the SEC or the CFTC changed their opinion. So again, I think everyone's trying to be a good actor in the space. So we introduced 2 bills that kind of help draw the jurisdictional lines. That this isn't, one government agency can't literally do all the things in the blockchain/crypto space. So the 2 bills, the Token Taxonomy Act and the Digital Taxonomy Act, help to acknowledge that multiple federal agencies have a role to play. The Token Taxonomy Act sort of drew the line in the sand. Hey, this is ICOs and some other limited cases. Those are securities. An investment or disclosure-based regulatory regime makes sense. But it also acknowledged that not all cryptos are investments. So the other point of the Digital Taxonomy Act is to acknowledge that a lot of things may have token components, but they're more technologies, the utility use cases. We're building these things because we want it to do something at the end. We don't do these things, just as an investment vehicle. So the Digital Taxonomy Act acknowledged that the FTC probably has a role to play in preventing fraud and marketing abuses that we've seen in some of the crypto space, and really just acknowledges that the FTC is sort of the agency that oversees a lot of technologies. So that's what that bill acknowledges.
And the CFTC, I know, has taken a tremendous amount of interest, and the Commodity Futures Trading Commission has, grew up with sort of the roots of agriculture, but over time has taken on the foreign exchange markets and swap markets and others. And I know they don't have sort of direct jurisdiction over sort of the exchanges in this place, but they do have a role to play if there is fraud. So I know they're potentially have a bigger role to play.
And part of that,
future.
They've been doing great work already, but there's a lot of government agencies, there's a resource issue. So that's one role we can play through our bosses, is making sure these agencies aren't underfunded, have the appropriate staff. So this isn't a way to say that they're not doing a good job, but this is an emerging technology, and we're going to have to start devoting more resources. So that's also part of the job we do, is making sure the people that oversee these space have the tools they need to keep up with the private sector.
Well, and I think that was one of the messages that we were receiving from the IRS for a long time, is that Congress passed this tax bill and handed that over, and it takes a while to get all of that implemented, and they can't necessarily divert resources to get into an issue of this nature. But that seems to be clearing up a little bit.
Kristen, I know you didn't add to this, but I think you've played quite a role with both the Token Taxonomy and Digital Taxonomy Act with your organization. And one thing I know is, just as an ex-regulator from the FDIC, there's only so much these agencies can do. They're limited in their scope. There's certain things they can act on, but at the end of the day, what I think we saw was the potential for these countries leaving the companies leaving the space to other countries. So the solution that's been driven by the Congressional Blockchain Caucus and these bills is a start in the direction of signaling the market kind of over, so to speak, those agencies, just to let these companies know that there is this help coming, and that there's the work in progress to make sure that they understand this is a new technology. We have to figure out maybe a different solution.
Yeah. Well, and I think I think from a broader policy-making perspective, there's obviously different ways to get changes to policy. There is working with Congress and getting new legislation passed, or agencies themselves are able to sometimes adopt policies within existing statutes to enhance technology. And then there's also sort of this third way, which my bias is much in favor of the first two options, but the courts, they sometimes, when there are questions, and I know just yesterday we saw for the first time the SEC has filed a complaint against a Canadian company, Kick Interactive, who initially did an ICO under securities laws, but then also did a follow-on sale of tokens that was, directly sort of to users who wanted to utilize the tokens, and but the SEC feels as if that were still, should have been under the scope of the securities laws, that there was enough information asymmetry there, that the disclosures that securities laws provide were necessary. And so it'll be interesting to see how that plays out. I don't know, I would just put you guys on the spot, but I know Alan might have some thoughts on that.
I would just add that the reason that for all of this is because of the uncertainty and the continued uncertainty that even when some regulatory agencies have put out guidance, it's just added more confusion. We're the only government that I can see that is regulating this sector in this way. And sometimes it should come down to more principles-based regulation where folks are able to understand the rules coming in.
And if I can chime in, so another thing that we've done with the Congressional Blockchain Caucus is we've held several roundtables. So just because our colleagues on the Hill aren't quite there yet doesn't mean that there isn't a great opportunity to see what's happening in the private sector and speaking with other folks in the public sector who get it and trying to see how we can reach some consensus on different things, just once Congress is ready and we've educated to try to push us forward. And so we've done a smart contract, or we just did a smart contract roundtable, but we did one last or the year before on identity, where we had worked with like NIST and they were phenomenal on kind of seeing what they were doing. And they just had their report that came out that was great. We did one on payments. We did one on supply chain last year, and then we just did one, like I said, on smart contracts. And sort of the theme that we saw, especially last year, and my boss ended up introducing legislation, was this need for federal support. My boss is from Arizona. Arizona has sort of moved forward on having, a fintech sandbox and has, different pieces of legislation at the state level that have passed, as well as, different folks in this room that have spoken. The states have moved ahead of us, and it's great. You want to bring in innovation coming into your state. Like, what's the best way to be like, I support what you're doing? Like, we're passing these bills and, pro-blockchain bills. And so from sort of the lessons we learned talking to, again, like different kind of folks was, we need federal support for blockchain. And so we introduced last Congress, and we'll be reintroducing again this year, a non-binding resolution in support of blockchain technology that mirrors what the European Union had done last year. Obviously, they had called it the distributed ledger technologies, but it's essentially, asking or essentially stating that we need more research in, different areas, and that there's a potential in like these different sectors, and we kind of need to keep like an open mind. So we'll be reintroducing that as well, because again, I think going back to some of the stuff that you said, we need that vision to sort of tell let everybody know that we are open for business. And so hopefully we can get some more support for this Congress to start getting that going.
Before we open it up for questions, maybe we'll go through one more time, and if anybody has any sort of final key takeaways they would like the audience to have, maybe starting with you, Alan.
Sure. So it's important to differentiate the benefits of this technology, of blockchain, when you're deciding whether to procure it or buy it or whatnot. The benefits are not just in digitization, right? You can use a variety of different technologies to digitize, but there really are unique benefits directly to blockchain. And my only word of caution is, so I've seen some folks in their implementations just rush to just digitize and not really embrace some of the unique and incredible benefits of shared trust architecture. And we want the government and government agencies to be able to adopt this technology, but we really don't want to build a blockchain to nowhere. So just like doing that alone is not enough. I think that some of the use cases I highlighted earlier and that were highlighted throughout the day are a great place to start to prove the value going forward, and I hope, I would just note that, yeah.
So what I would say is that with the two efforts with the appropriations, we talked about There was $100 million that we suggested as appropriation request for DARPA, and $30 million that we requested for NIST. And when I sort of suggested those numbers for DARPA to start investing in blockchain technology as a FFRDC, that came from the fact that, and that number was pulled from where China is working on this Belt and Road Initiative, and they're looking to develop a Belt and Road currency using blockchain, the Ethereum blockchain, and they talk about how they want to have a digital asset that's the most important asset in the world that's going to be bigger than the US dollar. So to me, I think that it's very important on the research and development. That's why actually today I've opening the Value Technology Foundation, working on some of the issues that came up earlier we talked about is what I want to address as far as a public-private partnership. There was a question earlier to Frank Yanis about how you deal with the permissionless versus permission blockchains. That's one thing I have to work with, and also as an ex-regulator, figure out solutions where regulators can actually test some of this enterprise software in a very quick fashion, because this is going to change month to month. So that's some of the things I'm trying to address is, I would say that, is it possible that this might happen where another country could end up with this technology over us? Let's not find out, because with the United States, we were at the forefront of the internet, and a lot of the internet and the work we do today, it's all US based, and it has open standards for free societies. And that's a critical part of this discussion. It goes to the regulations that might impact a company like Kik, that actually, it's important to note on Kik, that was the first company that actually, they didn't say it was fraud. It wasn't just some fly-by-night company. It was an established company. They just said, hey, you just didn't register this as a security. They didn't accuse them of fraud. Now, whether it was a security or not, that's something for the courts to decide. But the message that's sending and the confusion that continues to happen in this country, my fear is that we get bogged down in so much of this that we don't get ahead of this technology as we've always had as a history in the United States of doing.
And I guess I would stress two takeaways. The first is just the importance of building your blockchain network. And I mean that in the people sense, not in the technology sense. But actually, as a member of the planning committee, this organization, you just start to talk to more people. And I think most people in this room have the same big picture goals. And we're all devoting our time and energy on these things separately. And what I've found is the more you build out the network, the more you listen to people, you kind of build your inner circle of people that are working on various projects. I was very much a go-it-alone type, and just realized listening to people and interacting just makes life so much easier, especially when we are at this pivotal education phase. So mingle, meet people. I can't undersell the importance of that, just because there is such a profound potential with all these emerging technologies. But if we do it in a siloed nature, I think we set ourselves up to underachieve. And the second is, one of the themes today is, from local to global, and we're looking at state and municipality folks. This is the federal layer, and later we're going to hear about the international layer. And I think we are just trying to find what the proper role for each. We want municipalities and states to be innovative, and if they want to be the state leader on that, great. And we encourage them to do so. But there also is like a federal layer where we have to learn how we can help states interact with each other, coordinate federal resources. And then internationally, we have to figure out standards that, just because a technology was built domestically, that it can play nice with other technologies. So again, with building out your network, I think we also have to understand the proper role of each step. I think there is this is a private sector oriented thing. Everyone has their own interests, and I think that's the way the market works. I think that's the way the market should work. But I think we also need to be reflective and ask philosophically what the proper role in doing this, each of our roles, because I think a future where these technologies are deployed benefits everyone.
And so I have sort of two asks for the folks in the room. Keep giving us use cases, because use cases are great stories to tell when we're having these, briefings and one-on-ones with our members. And then for the government folks in the room, please use this as a resource for letting us know how we can help you. I think if you guys help us do those two things, we can continue moving sort of from this fiction to fact when talking about blockchain.
Well, if need be, I have a couple more questions, but why don't we open it up to the audience at this time? If anyone has any questions for our panelists. I saw somebody pointing somewhere.
Mike's on its way.
Oh, over there.
Sorry, the podium was blocking me. And again, I don't know who I'm directing the question at. So just as it relates to opportunity.
Can you hold that a little closer?
Sure.
Yeah.
We had y'all had touched on the taxation, and so one of the things that popped into my mind were about opportunity zones. That was part of the tax package that had been passed, and so without going into a lot of details about what opportunity zones are, just for those that don't know. There's an incentive for capital gains that are sitting out there to be invested. Have y'all had conversations amongst yourselves and with the members about whether or not the capital gains related to the digital assets and whether or not that qualifies to be invested in these opportunity zones? Because I imagine it's quite a large number, and it would be a shame if it wasn't able to affect some of the changes that I think everyone wants to see happen in these opportunity zones.
So I can touch, I am not a tax expert, so I do the tech things for my boss, but my boss is a very big numbers guy. Yes, I've heard him talk about this stuff several times, so I'm happy to connect with you offline to give you more information. But yeah, like that is absolutely one thing that I have heard him talk about several times. But like any specifics, that is the one area I am not.
And there are a couple other offices working on that as well. And what I would stress to you is don't be afraid to engage with your representatives as well. Sometimes that's bigger if a constituent group or a municipality comes to them directly. It's not just some staffer saying, one of the 100 things they hear all day. So I'd really suggest advocating for yourself. Come in with they like their one-pagers, and just have a plan in place, and sometimes that helps accelerate the process.
Okay, thank you very much.
Any other questions? We have time for one more, I've been told. I have one quick final question then, if nobody else does. One of the themes that kind of came up, whether we were talking about the federal government adoption of blockchain technology or sort of private sector applications. And I think maybe what's sort of striking to me is there actually is a concern that, the United States, which for a long time has been a leader in the financial services industry and a leader in technology, with this round might not be the case. Does anybody want to comment as to why that might be?
So we've seen a lot of other areas in other countries around the world, Singapore, the United Kingdom, several other European countries that have developed flexible frameworks that'll enable experimentation in financial services. Here in the United States, we've been very slow to do that. And as a result, the rigidity of our financial system has really held back a lot of emerging technology companies in the financial services sector, especially in insurance, especially in areas where we have a incredibly complex system like money sending licenses, where if you want to become a basic money sender in the United States, you have to have comply with all 50 states' money sending licenses. And they can be complex and they can be differing, and the definitions of a system and who controls cryptocurrency differs across them. So it's very complex. I heard estimates that it costs upwards of $3 million a year in order to comply with those kinds of frameworks. And because of this rigidity and this this traditionalized system in which we regulate financial services, oftentimes if you don't fit into the buckets that are already defined within the law, you just fall through. So a good case of this, there was a company that was trying to offer a blockchain-based system for financing trade. And because their system was weird, and because they tried to do it in a way that they weren't actually profiting, they came to the SEC and they said, hey, can we do this? And the SEC is, whoa, we don't even know what you are. Go to Europe, figure it out there, and come back when you've proved yourself. That is not a good model for regulating in this space. And I think we've started to see some of our financial regulators, especially at the CFTC, especially at what is Project Innovate? The Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, where they're trying to start creating these flexible frameworks for how they study and work with fintech companies, but it's been very slow, and we've been held back in many ways by very rigid viewings of the law.
Well, and I'm getting a hard stop sign here, so I'm sorry I have to cut you off, Jason. But thank you, everyone. I think everyone will be around for a minute or two if anybody has any questions. But thank you for being here today, and thank you to our panelists.